An empire that ruled the world for centuries, built not just on the strength of gladius swords and marching legions, but on something far more powerful: gold, grain, and the endless flow of commerce. How did such a vast civilization sustain its war machine and luxurious lifestyle? What made its economy pulse with life, and ultimately, what caused it to wither and die? Here's what might shock you. What if I told you that the economic crisis that brought down Rome has terrifying echoes in our world today? The same warning signs, the same mistakes, playing out on a global stage. Today, on Imperium Chronicles, we're about to uncover the secrets of the economy that fed Rome. From the silver denarius coin that united an empire, to the transcontinental trade routes that made merchants wealthy beyond imagination. We'll explore the bread riots that shook the capital and the devastating inflation that rocked the ancient world like nothing before it. Think you understand what really made Rome great? Think again. Behind every conquest, every monument, every gladiatorial spectacle, there was an intricate web of money, trade, and economic genius that would make modern Wall Street traders weep with envy. But here's the twist. This same system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The economic powerhouse that built the greatest empire in history also engineered its spectacular collapse. And the parallels to our modern economy? They're absolutely chilling. Before we dive into this incredible journey through time, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you're ready to have your mind blown by ancient history. Share this with anyone who loves epic stories from the past, and make sure to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles so you never miss our next documentary adventure. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Are you ready to discover how money, not just military might, conquered the world? Let's begin this extraordinary tale of wealth, power, and the rise and fall of history's most fascinating economy. Let me show you something that changed the world forever. Hold up a modern coin, any coin, and you're looking at an idea that revolutionized civilization 2,000 years ago. But the Romans didn't just create money, they weaponized it. Meet the denarius, a small silver coin that became the backbone of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. This wasn't just currency. This was power, control, and unity stamped into metal and scattered across 3 continents. Picture this. Before the denarius, the Roman world was economic chaos. Every city, every region had its own money, its own weights, its own measures. It was like trying to shop online today if every website used a different currency that changed value every hour. Trade was a nightmare, taxes were impossible to collect fairly, and the empire was bleeding money through confusion and corruption. Then came Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and he had a brilliant, almost diabolical idea. What if one coin could unite 60 million people under one economic system? What if that same coin could carry his face, his message, his authority into every marketplace from Britain to Egypt? The denarius became Augustus's secret weapon. Every coin was a tiny ambassador, spreading Roman values and imperial authority with every transaction. When a merchant in distant Gaul accepted a denarius, he wasn't just accepting money, he was accepting Rome itself. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The standardization was so precise, so carefully planned, that a denarius minted in Rome had exactly the same value as one made in Spain or Syria. This created something the world had never seen before. A truly unified economic zone spanning millions of square miles. Augustus's monetary revolution made collecting taxes from 60 million people not just possible, but efficient. Imagine the logistics. Before the denarius, tax collectors had to deal with hundreds of different currencies, weights, and measures. After Augustus, it was simple. Everyone paid in denarii, everyone understood the value, and the imperial treasury could finally keep accurate books. Now here's a mind-blowing fact that will change how you think about your paycheck forever. You know the word salary? It comes from the Latin word salarium, which literally means salt money. Roman soldiers weren't always paid in coins. Sometimes they received their wages in salt, one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. Think about it. Salt preserved food, making long military campaigns possible. It was so precious that Roman soldiers would literally fight for their salt. When someone wasn't performing well, commanders would say they weren't worth their salt, a phrase we still use today 2 millennia later. The denarius system was so successful that it lasted for over 400 years, longer than the entire history of the United States. But here's the thing that should terrify modern economists. When the denarius finally collapsed, it took the entire Roman Empire down with it. But money is worthless if you can't move it. And this brings us to perhaps Rome's greatest engineering achievement. Not the Colosseum, not the aqueducts, but something far more revolutionary. 400,000 kilometers of roads that transformed the ancient world forever. To put that in perspective, that's enough road to circle the earth 10 times. Imagine the ambition, the vision, the sheer audacity of connecting every corner of the known world with stone highways that would outlast the empire itself. These weren't just roads. They were the arteries of the world's first global economy. Every mile was precisely engineered, every stone carefully placed, because Rome understood something that would make modern logistics companies weep with envy. Speed is money, and information is power. A message could travel from Rome to the furthest British outpost in just 40 days. Troops could march from Syria to Spain using the same road system. But most importantly, merchants could move goods from one end of the empire to the other with unprecedented safety and efficiency. And this created something absolutely extraordinary, the world's first truly global marketplace. Picture this: Chinese silk flowing through Roman streets, Indian spices flavoring meals in London, Baltic amber adorning wealthy women in Alexandria. This was globalization 2,000 years before the internet, and it was breathtaking in its scope. Roman merchants were trading with civilizations so distant that most Romans couldn't even pronounce their names correctly. Silk from the Han Dynasty in China, pepper from the Malabar coast of India, precious stones from Ceylon, all flowing into Roman markets through an intricate web of trade routes that spanned 3 continents. But here's where our story takes a fascinating turn, because this global trade network was revolutionized by one man whose name you've probably never heard, but whose discovery changed world history. Meet Hippolus, a Greek merchant with the kind of adventurous spirit that built empires. Around the 1st century after Christ, Hippolus was frustrated. The journey to India took forever. Merchants had to hug the coastline, stopping at dozens of ports, paying tribute to local rulers, losing months of precious time. But Hippolus noticed something that Arab sailors had been whispering about for generations: the monsoon winds. These seasonal winds blew in predictable patterns across the Indian Ocean. What if, instead of following the coast, ships could sail directly across open water, riding these winds like an ancient highway in the sky? It was insanely dangerous. One miscalculation meant death in the middle of the Indian Ocean. But Hippolus took the risk, and when he successfully sailed direct from the Red Sea to India's western coast, he cut the journey time in half. This discovery, known as the Hippolus Wind, revolutionized Roman trade with the East. Suddenly, Indian spices and Chinese silk became not just available, but affordable. The volume of trade exploded, profits soared, and Rome's appetite for luxury goods became insatiable. Roman ladies wore silk so fine it was practically transparent, causing scandals in the Senate. Roman kitchens used black pepper so liberally that it became literally worth its weight in gold. The empire's elite developed tastes so exotic that Roman trade missions reached as far as Vietnam and Thailand. But here's the thing that should send chills down your spine. This global trade network made Rome incredibly wealthy, but it also made the empire dangerously dependent on foreign goods and foreign trade routes. When those routes were disrupted, when those supplies were cut off, the consequences would be catastrophic. But beneath all the glamour of silk and spices, beneath the glittering coins and magnificent roads, lay the true foundation of Roman wealth, something so fundamental that most people never even thought about it. The invisible gold that really powered the empire. Food. Welcome to the world of the latifundia, massive slave-worked estates that stretched across the Roman countryside like agricultural factories. These weren't quaint family farms. These were industrial-scale operations producing wheat, olive oil, and wine on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. Picture this: estates so vast that you could walk for days without leaving the property, worked by thousands of slaves, producing enough grain to feed entire cities. The wealth generated by these agricultural giants made their owners richer than kings, and their products literally kept the empire alive. But here's where the story gets dark. Because this agricultural miracle was built on human misery. Millions of slaves, captured in Rome's endless wars, were forced to work these fields under conditions so brutal that death was often preferable to life. And in 73 years before Christ, this system nearly brought Rome to its knees when a gladiator named Spartacus did the unthinkable. He turned agricultural slaves into an army. Spartacus wasn't just fighting for freedom. He was exposing the terrifying vulnerability at the heart of Roman power. The empire had become so dependent on slave labor that when those slaves rebelled, the entire economic system began to crumble. For 2 years, Spartacus and his army of former slaves terrorized the Roman countryside, destroying the very estates that fed the empire. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but the message was clear. Rome's agricultural wealth was a house of cards built on the backs of people who had nothing left to lose. But even when the slaves weren't rebelling, Rome faced a constant nightmare that kept emperors awake at night. What happened when the harvests failed? This is where Roman politics got truly sinister. When crops failed in Egypt or North Africa, when the grain ships were delayed by storms, the people of Rome began to starve. And hungry people, as every ruler knows, are dangerous people. So the emperors created something called the annona, free bread for the masses of Rome. This wasn't charity. This was political survival. As long as the people had bread, they wouldn't riot. But the moment that bread disappeared, the emperor's life was in danger. The annona became the ultimate political weapon. Popular emperor, make sure the bread flows freely. Unpopular emperor, watch as mysterious delays affect grain shipments and suddenly the crowds are calling for your head. But here's the terrifying mathematics behind this system. At its peak, Rome was giving away free bread to over 300,000 people every single day. That's more than 90 million loaves of bread per year, all coming from the imperial treasury. The cost was staggering, but the alternative was revolution. Roman emperors learned a harsh lesson that modern politicians know all too well. You can tax the rich, you can oppress the poor, but you cannot let the people go hungry. And speaking of economic lessons that echo through history, here's something that will blow your mind. Did you know that the Romans already suffered from devastating inflation? By the 3rd century after Christ, the denarius had lost 99% of its value. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that your life savings could barely buy a loaf of bread. If you're enjoying these incredible parallels between ancient Rome and our modern world, hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves fascinating history. And drop a comment below. Which economic parallel between Rome and today surprises you the most? I read every single comment, and your insights help shape our future episodes. Now comes the part of our story that should terrify anyone who understands economics. Because what happened to Rome in the 3rd century after Christ reads like a playbook for economic disaster that we're still using today. It started with something that sounds almost innocent: expensive wars. Rome had grown so large that defending its borders required constant military campaigns. The Germanic tribes were pressing from the north, the Persians were attacking from the east, and rebellions were erupting across the empire. Every battle cost a fortune, and Rome was fighting on dozens of fronts simultaneously. So the emperors did what desperate governments have done throughout history: they debased their currency. Instead of raising taxes, which would have caused immediate revolts, they simply made their coins worth less. Enter Nero, the emperor who literally fiddled while Rome burned. Nero discovered that if you reduce the silver content of your denarii and replace it with cheaper metals, you can mint more coins without mining more silver. Brilliant, right? Wrong. Catastrophically wrong. What Nero didn't understand, or didn't care about, was that he was essentially counterfeiting his own currency. When people realized that their silver coins were mostly copper and tin, they stopped trusting Roman money altogether. But Nero was just the beginning. Later emperors like Diocletian took currency debasement to levels that would make modern economists weep. By the late 3rd century, Roman coins contained less than 5% silver. They were essentially worthless metal tokens, backed by nothing but the emperor's increasingly empty promises. The result was economic chaos that makes our worst recessions look like minor hiccups. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. We're talking about hyperinflation so severe that prices increased by 15% every single year for decades. To put that in perspective, imagine if everything you bought today cost 15% more next year, and then 15% more the year after that, and the year after that. A loaf of bread that cost 1 denarius in the year 200 would cost over 16 denarii by the year 250. Your life savings would become worthless almost overnight. This is the same type of hyperinflation that destroyed Germany after the First World War, when people literally needed wheelbarrows full of money to buy groceries. Roman citizens faced identical nightmares, their life savings evaporating, their wages becoming meaningless before they could spend them. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating, because one emperor thought he could solve inflation with the stroke of a pen. In the year 301, Emperor Diocletian issued what he called the Edict of Maximum Prices, essentially ancient Rome's version of nationwide price control. Picture the audacity. Diocletian literally tried to control the economy by making it illegal to charge more than government-approved prices for everything from bread to labor, from clothing to construction materials. The edict covered over 1,000 different goods and services, with specific maximum prices listed for each. The penalties for violating these price controls? Death, not fines, not imprisonment, execution. Diocletian was so desperate to control inflation that he was willing to kill merchants for charging market prices. But here's the thing about economics that emperors never seem to understand. You can't solve supply and demand problems with swords and threats. When you force prices below market value, goods simply disappear from legal markets and reappear in black markets at even higher prices. Diocletian's price controls created exactly what every economist would predict: massive shortages, thriving black markets, and economic distortions that made the original inflation problem even worse. Farmers stopped growing crops they couldn't sell profitably. Merchants fled to regions outside Roman control. The economy didn't stabilize, it collapsed. Within a few years, Diocletian's price controls were quietly abandoned, but the damage was done. The Roman economy had been shattered by a combination of currency debasement, runaway inflation, and catastrophically bad government intervention. And here's the part that should send chills down your spine. Every single mistake that destroyed Rome's economy is being repeated by modern governments today. Currency debasement through endless money printing, inflation destroying the value of savings, and government price controls that create more problems than they solve. So what can we learn from Rome's spectacular economic rise and catastrophic fall? The lessons are so relevant to our modern world that they read like warnings from the future. Let's start with Rome's fatal addiction: military expansion. The empire grew so large that it could only sustain itself by conquering new territories, enslaving new populations, and plundering new wealth. But here's the economic trap that destroyed Rome. Expansion became more expensive than the wealth it generated. Think about the mathematics of empire. Early Roman conquests in Gaul and Spain brought in massive amounts of gold and silver, easily paying for the armies that conquered them. But as Rome expanded into poorer regions like Germania and Britain, the cost of conquest and occupation began to exceed the economic benefits. Rome had created what economists call a Ponzi scheme on a continental scale. The empire could only pay for its current military expenses by conquering new territories, but each new conquest required even more military spending. When Rome finally ran out of wealthy neighbors to plunder, the whole system collapsed like a house of cards. Now ask yourself, Do any modern superpowers rely on military spending and foreign interventions to maintain their economic dominance? The parallels are absolutely chilling, but military overstretch was just one part of Rome's downfall. Corruption became so systemic that it rotted the empire from within. Provincial governors bought their positions and then looted their provinces to recoup their investments. Tax collectors became extortionists, keeping most of what they collected for themselves. The very people responsible for maintaining Rome's economic system were actively destroying it for personal gain. And here's where it gets really interesting. Rome had all the ingredients for an industrial revolution 1,500 years before it actually happened in Britain. They had sophisticated engineering, advanced mathematics, abundant slave labor, and extensive trade networks. So why didn't Rome industrialize? The answer reveals a fundamental economic truth that applies to every society. Innovation requires incentives, and Rome's economic system actually discouraged technological progress. Why invent labor-saving machinery when slave labor was essentially free? Why develop new agricultural techniques when vast latifundia could simply use more slaves to increase production? Rome's reliance on slavery created a technological dead end that prevented the kind of innovation that could have saved the empire. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe centuries later, labor shortages after the Black Death forced societies to develop mechanical solutions to agricultural and manufacturing problems. Necessity truly became the mother of invention, leading directly to the Industrial Revolution that transformed the world. Rome's tragedy was that its early economic success created conditions that prevented future innovation. The empire became so efficient at extracting wealth from existing systems that it never developed the new technologies that could have sustained long-term growth. But perhaps the most haunting lesson from Rome is this: no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to economic collapse. Rome dominated the world for centuries, controlled more territory than any previous civilization, and seemed absolutely invincible. Yet within a few generations, hyperinflation, currency collapse, and economic chaos brought the entire system crashing down. The barbarian invasions didn't destroy Rome. They were the symptom, not the cause. Rome destroyed itself through economic mismanagement, and the barbarians simply moved into the vacuum left behind. Today, as we watch modern superpowers struggle with massive debt, currency debasement, military overstretch, and growing inequality, Rome's story reads less like ancient history and more like a preview of coming attractions. The question isn't whether our modern economic system will face similar challenges. It's whether we're smart enough to learn from Rome's mistakes before it's too late. Rome fell, but its lessons echo through the corridors of time like whispers from the grave. The Roman economy was a mirror that reflected both the brilliance of human ambition and the darkness of human folly. Every triumph contained the seeds of future disaster. Every strength became a fatal weakness. The denarius that united an empire became the worthless metal that destroyed it. The roads that carried prosperity also carried the barbarian armies that would sack Rome. The slaves who built Roman wealth eventually rebelled and shattered Roman power. The global trade that made Rome rich also made it dangerously dependent on forces beyond its control. And so we come to the question that should haunt every thinking person in our interconnected world. Is our globalized era repeating the exact same mistakes that brought down the greatest empire in human history? Look around you. We have a global currency system based on debt and endless money printing. We have military superpowers stretching themselves across the globe at enormous expense. We have growing inequality, systematic corruption, and economic policies that prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability. We have technology that Rome could never have imagined, but we're making the same fundamental errors in economic thinking that destroyed them 2,000 years ago. But here's the thing about history that gives me hope. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The patterns are similar, but the outcomes aren't predetermined. We have something Rome never had: the ability to learn from their mistakes before we make them ourselves. Understanding the past isn't just about satisfying intellectual curiosity. It's about survival. Rome's economic collapse wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people who thought their empire was too big to fail. They were wrong, and their civilization paid the ultimate price. But we don't have to follow their path. We can choose differently. We can learn from their errors, adapt their successes, and avoid their catastrophic mistakes. The knowledge is there, waiting for us in the ruins of history. Every denarius tells a story. Every road leads to a lesson. Every economic decision made in the marble corridors of ancient Rome offers guidance for the challenges we face today. The Romans thought they were building something that would last forever. Instead, they created a cautionary tale that's more relevant today than ever before. If this journey through Rome's economic rise and fall has made you think differently about our modern world, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button to help more people discover these crucial historical lessons. Drop a comment below and tell me which parallel between ancient Rome and today shocked you the most. Your insights always inspire our next deep dives into history. And if you want to join me on more incredible journeys through time, make sure you're subscribed to Imperium Chronicles with notifications turned on. Because trust me, the stories we're uncovering from the past have never been more important for understanding our future. Until our next historical adventure, remember, those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat its tragedies. But those who study the past hold the keys to a better tomorrow. See you in the next Chronicle.